So now that we've covered those last bits, it's now time for us to move up into building this 3D clock. And so if you remember, I'm going to cover about the first half of this. Please go through this on your own. There's a lot of great information in here. And the first step with building this clock is we're going to build the face and all the hour indicators and the hours, minutes, and seconds. So to start with the main clock part, we're going to start with a cylinder. And sometimes it like randomly places somewhere. Just reset that, put it right dead center in our view. I'm going to press the E key for rotation. Rotate it down. It looks like to have it face toward the camera, it's like -90. All right, that looks good. I'm going to go into the R for scaling. I'm just going to scale this down a little bit. Just get it to like the depth of what clock face might be like. And then this green outline is actually this capsule collider. And we don't need a physics collider on the clock face, so I'm just going to remove that. And I'm just going to move it up a little bit, just so you're aware that this is like an icon for the sun, the daylight system, and I don't want you to connect it with having to deal with the cylinder. So I'm going to go back into game view, and I just so happen to, happy coincidence, I moved over to sun. But I just want to look at the size of it. So it looks a little small, so I'm just going to bring it up a little bit. Yeah, it looks about right. That's about the right size, but you keep adjusting it until it feels right. And since I scaled the entire thing up at the center, it's a little thick now. I'm just going to scale it down. And this will act well for our clock face. And I should just make a parent. I'm going to make an empty game object. I'm just going to call it clock. And I'm just going to zero out its transform. It's at the center of the world. And this will be like the parent, the root of the clock. I don't want anything on there. I'm just going to end up putting some scripts here, but I don't want any geometry at the top there. So for this cylinder, notice I did some rotation, I did some scaling. I'm just going to take that position and move it back down, just so that when I move it inside of the clock, they're like completely lined up with each other. Then what I can do is I can take this parent, this clock, and I can move it back up out of the way. All right, so we got a root, and I'm going to call this the clock face. Now, one thing I'm going to note is that, notice how it's like really bright on the back side and it's dull on the front. And that's because the sun, the daylight system, it's behind it. And if I rotate the sun, you notice how it kind of changes the coloring. That's because it's a standard shader and it's meant to interact with the light source. But since this is more of like a UI element, it's not going to be like a 3D object out in the world. It's meant to be part of my UI. I kind of want it to have a non-changing color. I don't want it to be impacted by the light source. So I'm just going to create another material. I'm call it clock face. And instead of it being a standard shader, I'm going to use unlit. I'm not going to have it lit by a light source, and I'm just going to have it a basic color, an unlit color. And I'm just going to apply that to the clock face. Either you drag it here in the inspector or you drag it up here in the hierarchy. And now I can change the color of it. If you don't want it to be like a bright white, you can change whatever color you want. But it's just, now it's not impacted by the light source. It's just a neutral color all the time. That's all I want. All right. So next, I can think about creating a cube. And I'm going to call it, this is going to be my hour indicator. And I'm just going to drag it underneath our clock grouping, and notice it's offset a little bit. I'm just going to reset that, put it right in the center. And I'm just going to scale it down. I'm going to look at my clock face over here. Something like that looks about right. And I'm just going to keep messing with the scaling. All right, now it's inside the clock. I'm just going to move it out a little bit. And this should be good for my indicator. Maybe a little bit bigger. Okay. And I'm just going to create a material for it. I made that by mistake. I'm going to call it clock indicator. I already have a name for it. All right, call it one. And remember, we're going to use an unlit color material. And usually these are just black or some type of dark tone. Oops, I don't want it on the face. I want it on the indicator. All right, now next. So this looks pretty good and it's colored right. And I can move it up into position, say, oh, you know, this really represents 12 o'clock. So I can just rename that to 12. And then I could duplicate it. Be like, okay, this is going to be my 1 o'clock. And then I can kind of move it. You can move it left and down, or you can use this little square here to do both. And then you can even kind of rotate it, find the best position for it. You'd be like, okay, that's my 1 o'clock. You could duplicate that, make it a 2, move it down, rotate it. But it's not consistent. We have 12 hours in a day. I'm sorry, 12 hours in a cycle, 24 hours in a day, but 12 hours in a clock. And a clock's a circle, 360 degrees. And so we have 360 degrees divided by 12 hours. We have 30 degrees per hour. So I can actually use this parenting system, this empty game objects, to help me build this clock face, which is more symmetrical. You don't really want to build it by hand. It's not going to look right. So I can just make a game object, bring it in, reset it so it's dead center in the clock. I'm going to get rid of these because I was manually trying to position them. But I can bring this 12 over. I can just duplicate it. All right, I'll just call it 1. But now that, notice it's with underneath this game object, and the game object's dead center of the clock, and the 1 is way up top. So if I just figure out which way to rotate this game object, it looks like I need to rotate it -Z. It's just arbitrary. It's just the way I built the clock. For you, it might be positive 30, or it might be on the x-axis or whatever. But if I just type in -30, and it rotates 12 o'clock perfectly into place into 1 o'clock. So I didn't need to do any, guesstimating there. So I could just say, that's my 1 o'clock. It's perfectly placed in response to my 12 because I'm rotating this parent object about the center of the clock. And so it's a really handy way to position out my hour indicators. So I can take this 1 o'clock, duplicate it. I can pull the 1 o'clock out because I'm done rotating it. And I can call this 2 and just rotate another 30 degrees and duplicate it out, and then rotate this another 30 degrees, duplicate, rename, rotate 30 degrees, pull it out, rename, rotate 30 degrees, pull it out, rename, rotate 30 degrees, duplicate, pull it out, rename, rotate 30 degrees, duplicate, pull it out, rename, let's see, rotate 30 degrees, duplicate, pull it out, rename, pull it out. You can see I'm just going right around the clock face and I'm just building it out perfectly. So duplicate, rename, pull it out. And this should be my last one. 90. Oop, let me see something. 6, 7, 8, 9. Oops, this one's 9. You got a lot of order here. It won't let me rename it. Okay. So this will be my 10. Okay, move this. 300. All right, duplicate, rename. Cool. Pull it out and you're done. So I did this for positioning all 12 of these hour indicators. Well, I guess 11, 12 didn't need this effect. But notice how if I move through these all, they all have these increments of 30 degrees based on their clock face position. And I'm going to use that later on with my scripts. When the user clicks on these, I can use that difference in degrees to tell which hour that the user is clicking on. But now that that's all built, this isn't needed anymore, so I can just remove it. It was just used for rotating these things into position. And next I can work on the hours, minutes, and seconds. So this will be my hour hand. Reset it into position. Scale it, use that, it's a little fatter. All right, a little skinnier. All right, that might be a good hour hand. And usually hour hands, they don't sit like dead center of the clock. So just moving them up a little bit. And let's give it the black color. And if you rotate it, just make it a little thicker. Okay. And if you rotate it to try to simulate what the clock hands may look like, you'll notice it's not supposed to rotate around the center point. So the position and the structure of it looks good, but the rotation, I don't want to rotate it about the center point. So here, so here we can make use of an empty game object again. So I'll create one, I'll bring it in, reset it, put it in the dead center of the clock. I'm going to put the hour hand underneath it. And when I'm rotating, I'm going to rotate about the pivot. So when I rotate now, it's rotating like an offset pivot. So the parent game object is dead center of the clock, which is not dead center of the geometry. So if I go back to center, it's going to find like the center point of it itself and its children, the geometry underneath it. And if you notice, it's going to rotate about the center of the geometry, much like if I click on the child and child just rotates about center point. I don't want that. So if I go and pivot, it'd be like, all right, this new empty parent, I want to rotate about its center point. Just ignore the whole like center of all, if it's geometry underneath it, just rotate about center point. So it's like offsetting the pivot of its rotating. So now we're rotating about the center of the clock, not the center of the geometry of the hour hand. And so this is really useful as well with this parenting of this empty game object. We can now use it to offset the pivot of how we're rotating. So that's correct. Maybe I'll just call this like hour rotator. All right. And so since I built the whole hour hand correctly with the hour rotator and the hour geometry, I actually could just duplicate this whole thing and just call it minute rotator. And just call this minute. And I'm not interested in moving the rotator. It just stays at the dead center of the clock. But a minute hand is a little bit skinnier. It's a little bit longer. And it's going to sit on top of the hour hand. And it would move up a little bit. And it might look something like that. And then let's try rotating this thing. Like, okay, that works pretty good because I did the whole situation. I duplicated from its parent. I took the rotator object and the geometry, and the rotator object, the empty parent, is still at the center of the clock. So everything is set up well, and I can even duplicate this thing and call this the second rotator. Call this the second hand. And usually I have another color, so usually it's like a red. And we're going to go to unlit color, make it like a strong red. Cool. And now we have to model this thing. So usually the second hand's a little bit skinnier, a little bit longer, and it will sit on top of the minute hand. Just move it up a little bit. There we go. Now we have our second hand. And second hand is modeled, moved into position, and if we rotate it based on its empty parent, it's not going to rotate about its center point. It'll rotate about the center of the clock. So this looks really good. Awesome. So we are done. We have created our clock group that if I grab it at the top, I can move the whole thing together because I'm moving the transform that everything else is contained into. They all move together as a group. And we have our hour hand, which has a rotator group on it, which has an empty parent object that we act as a rotator so that we can offset the pivot. And the minute hand and the second hand, all of which has an empty group above it so that we can offset the rotation pivot. And then we have the hour indicators, 12 to 11, all of which have 30-degree increments in the Z rotation that we built using an empty game object. We just pulled it out. And we have the clock face, the big clock face on top. Notice everything else does have their colliders. Like we will need the colliders for the hour hands. And actually, now that I said that, we actually do not want the colliders. So I don't want a collider on the hour hand geometry. I don't want a collider on the minute hand geometry. And I don't want a collider on the second hand. We're not going to click on those. Those are just moving. They're animating with system time. Now these hour indicators we will be clicking on. So I'm going to keep the colliders on them. All right. So we built the entire clock from scratch using pieces of geometry. and using empty game objects to help with positioning everything. And then next week, we're going to get into all the coding that makes the clock run and connect it up with our light source. So please continue and move through this PDF, this tutorial here, and do what I did. All right. Thank you.